Welcome to the first of 5 webinar series from the Boone Center for the Family. Today we're going to talk about when hard times produce pain, and in the next 4 weeks we'll be doing seminars on identity, anxiety, loneliness, and finances. Hi, I'm Sharon Hargrave, and I'm the Executive Director of the Boone Center for the Family at Pepperdine University.
And I'm Terry Hargrave. I'm the Evelyn and Frank Fried Professor of Marriage and Family Therapy at Fuller Theological Seminary.
Today we want to talk about when hard times produce pain. And what we are aware of is the coronavirus has actually increased pain in several issues, and we want to talk about those things. I think about those of you that are pastors that are involved with your church, and you've just gotten your church to a place of attendance that you were excited about, or big events that were coming up that you were excited about, and now suddenly we're stay at home. Or you're a Pepperdine student and you thought you were going to have a spring of athletic competition or a play or performances, and those things are no longer happening. Then we have people that deal with issues of pain that are more intense, maybe the death of a close friend due to the coronavirus, or maybe the loss of a job. So those kinds of things really increase our pain level. One thing that I found interesting as I've thought about pain in the situation is that the exact same situation can cause both joy and pain. An example in my life would be that we have our children that both live in New York City, and our son and his wife have decided to shelter in place with us in Los Angeles, and our daughter and her husband are sheltering in place in New Jersey. So where our son being here is very joyful, our daughter and her 2 kids being away from us is producing pain. And I've also noticed not only a situation, but the exact same stimulus can create both joy and pain. Maybe a video of my new grandson can make me feel happy and smile and make me feel a sense of peace. And then maybe that same video can also make me feel a sense of sadness. So what we want to do today is we want to talk about when pain causes us to react to things in a way that's not healthy, that's not helpful, that's not good in relationships. Every one of us, every day of our life, wakes up in the morning with 2 basic questions on our mind. One of those questions that we have is a question of love or a sense of identity. Who am I? When we feel like we're worthy, when we feel like we're unique, when we feel like we're not alone, these questions strengthen our identity, and we can really feel that we're strong in our confidence and we're strong in our identity. The other question that we wake up asking ourselves every morning is this question of trust. Trust informs us about, are we safe? So if things are predictable, which they are not right now, if we feel like people are being honest with us, and there's all these issues right now in the world of openness and fairness, or openness in the news media and everything, we feel safe. If things are fair, we feel safe. So you can see how our questions of identity, who am I, and trust, am I safe, have been questioned during this time of the coronavirus. Terry and I are both marriage and family therapists, and over the years in the therapy room, we have begun to notice that when people feel their pain is violated, that they react in certain ways. One thing I want to clarify is when we are at peace or when we are calm, we are fine. We react with people well, we make good decisions, we interact well, all that is good. But when we feel a sense of pain, we tend to react in different ways. When we feel pain and stress, what we've noticed in the therapy room is sometimes people they respond in a way that's very blaming. It's kind of a response that if you hadn't done that, we wouldn't have this problem. People who are blaming, or you can see on the screen, they can be angry, they can be rageful, they can be threatening, they can be punishing. Those kind of people, when they feel a sense of pain, can respond in these ways. Another way that people can respond when they feel a sense of pain is this whole idea of shame. Shame is more like, oh gosh, if I hadn't said that, what was I thinking? Why did I do that? Those kind of responses when we feel pain come across as more depressed, negative, manipulative, needy responses. And those kind of issues you can see can come up when our identities are questioned. When we feel a lack of sense of safety a lot of times, we might respond more in other ways. The first way we might respond is more in a control response that says, okay, I don't feel safe, so if I can just control the environment around me, I'll do better. So we try to get everybody in our world to do things exactly the way we need to have them done. Controllers are perfectionistic, they're critical, they can not be emotional at all and intellectualize everything. And they're they can look very successful on the outside because they get things done, but they can be really hard to work with or really difficult to live with if you live with a controller. The last way that people respond is this whole idea of escape. Escapers kind of believe if I just get away from the situation, it'll be okay. The problem is when we return to the situation, it's still there. The problems are still the same. Escapers can come across as irresponsible, they can be selfish, they can just be people that withdraw from situations all the time. Now, as I've walked through these 4 common responses to pain, I have a feeling that some of you may be thinking, yes, that's my spouse, or, oh yeah, that's my pastor, or that's the person on my church committee, or that's my adult child. What we really want you to think about in this case is, what is it that I do when I feel a sense of pain? Because in all honesty, the only person in your life that you can really change is you. And if you can create in your responses positive, healthy responses, then you can be more effective in your relationships, both of leadership and of family relationships. So what I want to do is I want to talk through this whole idea of what a pain cycle is. I also want to note that if you all have questions, we are going to have a question and answer period at the end. So feel free to be giving your questions into the Q&A right now. And as I talk about the pain cycle, what I want you to understand about the pain cycle is that you cannot change what you will not name. So it's very important as we think about the pain cycle that we are naming the things that we feel and our negative or destructive coping. In my own personal life, just a very brief scenario is that I had a lot of trauma happen in my life when I was young. My father committed suicide when I was 3. I had a brother that died of acute leukemia when I was 4, and another brother that was murdered when I was 13. So when I tell you about those situations, I think you can probably easily understand that feelings that are very uncomfortable for me are the feelings that I feel when I'm either feeling like I'm alone or unsafe. And I have learned about myself as I've begun to draw out my pain and my peace cycle, that when I feel alone and unsafe, what I do is I become controlling first. I try to get everybody around me to do what I need for them to do. And then if that doesn't work, I step over into the blaming section and I become more critical. Some of you may wonder, can I do more than one of the coping mechanisms, or do I do all of them? Or and you can do one of them, you can do 2 of them, or you can do all 4. I personally have 2 that I turn to more, the controlling and the critical. Now you can tell or you can see through my completed pain cycle here that when I get controlling and when I get critical, I tend to get a reaction from other people. They withdraw from me or they get angry. Now you can see how that withdrawal and that angry can hit over into me feeling alone and unsafe. Now what happens here in relationships is this cycle happens with all my relationships, whether it's my colleagues at work, the people that I attend church with, my adult children, anybody in my life, I'm going to have some sort of pain cycle with. So just kind of as a quick example, we wanted to put up for you what would be our pain cycle as a couple. And our pain cycle as a couple looks something like this. Terry will tell you that we've got to get that pain cycle up. Terry would tell you that his coping mechanisms are different than mine. He feels unloved and unwanted and like he can't measure up. And when he feels those things, what he turns to is to withdraw and then try to perform and then to get angry on top of that. Now you can see if he withdraws and he shames himself and he gets angry, that it moves over into making me feel alone or unsafe. And when I feel alone and unsafe and I start doing my destructive behavior of being controlling and critical, then that hits right into Terry's feelings of feeling unloved and unwanted and he can't measure up. So what we need you to understand is you have this cycle with everybody. The part of the cycle that you can actually change is your own half of this cycle. And when you change your half of your responses to pain, it's going to change your home relationships, your work relationships, your church relationships. Recently, we've done a study with the Barna group, and we're going to be announcing the launch of this study next week in Restoring Relationships. And what we have learned in this is that when people feel pressure in their relationships and their mental health concerns, one of the first places they want to turn is the church. There's many other interesting statistics in this report. We just wanted to give you this slide so you can see some of the results here. Terry's going to talk now a little bit about how do we get out of this pain cycle.
Well, I think that one of the things that you have to realize is that all pain, no matter where the pain comes from, it triggers you into the pain cycle. That kind of pain motivated in your identity or your sense of safety forces you into that reactivity. The answer to that is not to make others responsible for your pain or you weren't safe enough for me or something of that nature. Really, the answer to that kind of pain is learning how to self-regulate yourself, really getting in touch with your own identity of who you are, getting in touch with what you can do to make yourself safe. You know, others can contribute some to your sense of safety, but the honest truth is that we're the most powerful people to be able to speak to our own sense of identity and own sense of safety. You know, many people say, well, God or others are much, much more powerful in forming this. Well, certainly God is more powerful than we are, but God gives us a freedom to be able to decide who we are and what we are, and whether or not we believe what God actually says about us. So in the end, it's still, God commissions us as the most powerful beings and our own sense of safety. So I think that it's really important for us to realize that we have a choice about what we pay attention to in terms of our own identity. You know, our friend Sheila Boss reminded us recently of a quote that was meaningful to her in a great time of illness and sickness, and where she lost a lot of her capabilities. And she said this quote from Viktor Frankl really helped her realize that she has more power over her own emotions than what she thought. This is the quote. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Everything can be taken from a man or a woman, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Well, that's what we want to talk about in terms of moving yourself and self-regulating yourself into the truth. That's not an easy thing to do, but it's quite possible in terms of making yourself vulnerable to and influenceable to your own sense of belonging. When we say to ourselves, when we don't let those messages, for instance, in my own case about being unloved or being unwanted, or I can't measure up, when I don't let those things stand, when I say, no, I really am a being that's loved. I have people around me who love me and care for me. I know that God loves me. I know that that's important. I know that there are situations where I indeed am not perfect, but I do measure up. You see, those are clear expressions of identity and safety that help us feel a sense of peace. And God talks a lot about how we need to drill into this sense of peace. God says, I am the God of peace. Christ says to us, peace I give to you, my peace I give to you. When we have that feeling, you see, we're not caught in pain. We feel loved and we feel safe. And that gives us an alternative of, instead of blaming, actually acting very nurturing in these kind of encouraging, supportive, and accepting ways. Instead of shaming ourselves, it gives us the option of valuing ourselves and really being positive and hopeful about what the future can bring for us. Instead of being a controlling individual that's invulnerable, that it has to be all my way or I have to make it happen, I can actually be balanced in this give and take, where I appreciate the work of my spouse or my partners or my coworkers, and I let them do their part and I can do my part. And instead of escaping, I can actually connect to the family members around me, in a reliable, connecting way. I can be more responsible and attentive to the relationship. That's what's important. Now you can see how changing the perspective into one where you're focused on a hopefulness. If you remember from my pain cycle, what I felt was I felt unloved, unwanted, and like I couldn't measure up. That caused me to withdraw, perform, and really eventually lead me to get angry. If I look into myself and I say, I'm going to make a choice, an empowered choice to choose differently, I'm going to choose my own way, then I would concentrate on the truth of saying, no, I'm really loved. People around me love me. They want me. And I'm man enough to face the next objective that I have to. Doesn't mean I'm perfect. Doesn't mean I'll always be successful, but I am able to face life one objective at a time. When I feel that way, when I calm those emotions that are hitting on my own depression or my own sense of inadequacy, you see, that allows me to then connect to other individuals. It allows me to value myself as I should, and moves me, quite frankly, into nurturing. You can see how that's so much better. It allows me to interact with others in such a way that leads them to engage with me, connect with me, and nurture me. And of course, that feeds right into me feeling loved and wanted. It's like the pain cycle spirals people downward in more despair and negativity. The peace cycle tends to spiral people upwards into positivity and hopefulness. That's the peace cycle. That's the secret of the peace cycle. And of course, that works in the same way in reciprocating relationships as the pain cycle does. For instance, in Sharon and I's relationship, when I feel loved, wanted, and man enough, and I act in connecting and self-valuing ways and nurturing, that builds into Sharon's truth of not being alone and safe in God's economy. When she feels that way, she doesn't have to have control. She moves to be a more balanced person in give and take and actually nurturing to me. And that turns us into a peaceful interaction and a peaceful couple as we interact with others around us. There's a reciprocation in this framework that builds relationships. One of the things that we really have to concentrate on, I think, in our relationships with other people and ourselves is to realize that this whole idea fits scripturally into what God wants us to pay attention to. It's a message of hopefulness. Our pain drives us away from God and makes us feel sorry for ourselves. A sense of hopefulness drives us into God. This is really clear in Romans chapter 5, where Paul says, it's not only the good things that we rejoice in, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing this, that sufferings lead to endurance. Endurance leads to character building. And character building then results in hopefulness. And hope does not disappoint. God is active in these times. Hard times actually do produce character in us. And it gives us a marvelous opportunity to learn about how we can be more active in God's plan to actually move us into certain areas of our lives where we need to be better. This is the verse that we love. It's based on the Pauline theology of the old self and new self. Ephesians chapter 4, 22 through 24. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. You see, it's actually God's plan for us to learn to move past our pain cycles and into the peace cycle. Now, to be very honest with you, that is not an easy thing to do. It takes some practice, it takes some attention, and it takes some really intentionality on each of our parts. One of the things that we do is we ask people all around the world to really pay attention to the idea of when you are in your pain, when you get triggered, or when you get emotionally at your worst. These are opportunities to actually practice moving yourself into a more positive frame. So we say that these 4 steps really can be helpful to you. When we find ourselves in pain, we remind ourselves, yes, I feel unloved, I feel unwanted, I feel alone, I feel out of control, I feel unsafe. Maybe those are the feelings that you have. But then say what you normally do out loud. Because when you say those things out loud, like I get angry or I start blaming others, you start realizing that's not what I want to do. That's not going to be good for me. And it's certainly not God's plan for me. When we say the truth, when we reaffirm those things in a positive way, when we concentrate on those positive things, then we can move ourselves into a positive framework of saying, I need to do something differently. And then I can actually do it. It's much better for me than yelling at Sharon when something's not going my way, to actually focus on nurturing her in a positive way. These things are based on neurological research. They're easily practicable, and you can actually move yourself and tell the difference in your relationships.
So we're going to move to a question and answer period now. If you have some questions, be sure and submit those. We do have more information on our website that helps you understand the pain and the peace cycle more. And just want to remind you that we have upcoming webinars about loss of identity due to job loss or loss of athletic competition. We have one on anxiety, loneliness, and finances, where we can flesh out some of these concepts a little bit more. This has kind of felt like a really quick run. We typically do this information in a much longer time, but we wanted to make the webinars quick enough that you can step in your workaday world and gain some information and then step back out. So if we have some questions now, we'd be happy to take those questions, and we look forward to seeing you at the upcoming webinars.
Hey, Sharon and Terry. So we do have a few questions that have come in. The first one is about someone who has expressed that their pain triggers a lot of insecurities for them. What might you advise for someone who's working on a way to develop a sense of freedom from any insecurities that keep coming up?
I would say part of what you have to begin to identify first is, where do those insecurities come from? So in my example of my pain cycle, I can say, I know my insecurities come from the fact that I had a lot of trauma in my youth when I was young. And as I begin to identify those insecurities from that experience, I can then question the things I'm telling myself. So when I begin to tell myself, because of what's happened to me before, that I'm all alone, I need to stop and say, is that really true? No, I've been married to the same person for 40 years. I have friends, I have colleagues. There's a lot of people in my life, and I'm not really alone. So beginning to identify the messages that we're giving ourselves that just aren't true. In this world right now, there's a lot of things that we can be telling ourselves that when we feel panicked are not true, but when we can calm ourselves, they're not true. Is there anything you would add?
I would also say that it's also helpful to remember your own legacy when you're developing a sense of your own insecurities. You know, you've had plenty of times where you have been capable, where you've met expectations, where you have been successful. Remembering those and concentrating and thinking on those things actually reassures you. I may not be perfect, I may not do everything super, but I'm certainly capable in my life and willing to meet the challenge.
That's great. I'm sure that's really, really helpful insight into how we can attack some of those recurring insecurities that keep coming up. We have another question that is from someone anonymous. It says, what do we do when people are injured within dysfunctional Christian environments and they equate the abuse and rejection with God?
Yeah, I think that this is a really important area for us to address. So remember that pain can come from anywhere, but not necessarily, so an organization can cause that pain as well. But the organization itself, particularly the church, is made up of a group of people that are imperfect and in fact have the same kind of pain cycles that we do. And pain, as Sharon was talking about, produces reactivity that is blaming, shaming, controlling, and escaping. So it's really, there's a high chance that you have been one of the people that have been boogered up by that kind of reactivity from people in the church. If that's the case, it's important to realize that while those people may have hurt me, I still have more power than those people to be able to speak into myself. God has a very different message for me if I choose to listen to that message. At the same time, I need to be in that kind of relationship to work through those issues with those people And I can still be constructive, even if they're not, even if they are in their pain cycle. That doesn't mean that I have to be in my pain cycle.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and Terry said this, but I just want to emphasize, I think a problem that we've gotten ourselves into a lot in our society these days is we let the people outside of ourselves identify who we are. And I think if somebody has been really hurt by a church or really hurt by an organization, number one, this whole idea you can't change what you will not name. Number one, what are the messages you're giving yourself and how can you change that? Because you want to give yourself the message that's true. And we don't want to give a church or another person or a spouse or anybody in our life the power to define us. We want truth to define who we are. Yeah.
That's great. On a similar note, we're getting some more questions coming in as we go. But on a similar note, how can we help other people recover from these destructive things? So you mentioned a lot of really great ideas for work within ourselves. What would you advise for help coming alongside of others?
One of the great things about this kind of work is that it's reciprocating. The best thing that you can do to help other people work on their issues of pain is for you to work on your pain yourself. When we get frustrated with individuals that are depressed or are too scared or are worried about the future, that's not going to do them any good when we get angry at them or we get frustrated or we withdraw from them. What we can do is address our own pain and realize that that cues up my own anxiety or that cues up my own negativity. When I address those things and saying, no, what I want to concentrate on is being a loving person. I know that I may not be safe in this kind of unsafe world, but I am empowered to make good choices. It motivates me to be nurturing and kind and connecting to that person that's in pain.
I think another thing is helping people by telling your own story. Terry and I are marriage and family therapists, and I think in some ways we live a lot like pastors sometimes, in that people think that because we're marriage and family therapists, we should never have any marital problems, just like leaders in the church or those kind of things. I think they look at you and they say, well, you never get angry, or you never are controlling, or you're always in control of things. I think one of the most powerful things that we've experienced in our life is when we're vulnerable enough to share our own story that says, when I get into a painful situation, this is the destructive behavior I have. I can't tell you the number of people that have thanked us for saying, thank you for sharing your story, because when you share your story, I feel normal. I feel like I can work on things. I feel like I can make things different. I don't feel like I have to live up to an impossible standard. So always with the pain and the peace cycle, the people that we train at our Relate Strong trainings and through the other trainings that we have at the Boone Center for the Family at Pepperdine, we always say, know your own cycle first so you can share it with others, because when they see it work in your life, it's very, very powerful. I think maybe, April, we have time for one more question or maybe two, depending on what you have there. We don't have a specific end time, but what do you think?
I would love to get one, maybe two more questions, if that's okay. Anyone who has a hard stop, of course, can get going and access all this later. But we have been getting a lot of questions along the similar lines of, now you've laid out a lot of ways that we can understand our own cycles. What can we do to break our cycles? A lot of people have mentioned, what about when the pain cycle feels normal and comfortable, and peace can even feel uncomfortable, or just breaking that repetition? How do we disrupt it?
What we know neuropsychologically is actually the brain, with all things being equal, will go negative. It will go back to what it already knows. It will go back to the old familiar patterns. That's one of the real challenges for us spiritually, is because we're told directly by Paul, not only in taking off the old self and putting on the new self. He says, don't be conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In other words, what Paul is saying 2,000 years before neuropsychology told us this, is that we have to be intentional, volitional, really intending to change our behaviors. And that first takes place in the mind. That decisional process of saying, I don't want to be angry anymore. I don't want to be shaming myself anymore. You know, I'm a person that is prone to depression. Every day where I wake up, I have to make a decision. Am I going to get fully dressed? Am I going to make up the bed in the morning? Am I going to not say negative things? I have to make those decisions all through the day, because most of those decisions come from my natural tendency, my more comfortable position of being depressed. Even though I hate my depression, my brain feels it's most comfortable. It takes practice, like we're talking about. It takes intentionality. But if you're willing to put in the work, just like it's just like physically working out, you will see results. Not immediately, but you will see results by the end of the week.
I also encourage you to download the information that we sent you and physically start to write out your own pain cycle and your own peace cycle, because it helps move it from the emotional fight and flight brain, part of your brain, into the prefrontal cortex where you can really think about it. And so that's the beginning of an exercise. I'd also encourage you to come back to some of the other seminars, because then we'll have time to flesh it out a little bit more in some of these more specific issues.
Thank you. So I'd like to just mention one thing. We're getting a lot of questions about if this webinar will be accessible later on for video for reference, some of the slide information and links, which will absolutely be available to you and provided to you. I would like to get one more question, and then I think we're going to have to wrap things up. We have a question on how can pastors quickly highlight some of this information for their sermons?
I think one thing I'm going to do is point you to the Boone Center for the Family website. We have written a book there, actually. It's for helping explain the pain and the peace cycle. We've written it for church leaders a lot to use with sermons or, in teaching opportunities. Because what we identify, and maybe you have had this experience yourself, but people understand their pain cycle really quickly. They start saying, you're right, that's me, I do this, and they want to make a change. So I think with some of the tools that we have available on our website, from taking some of that material and from what we've shared today, that you can share this material quickly in a sermon and get people beginning to think about, what are the messages that I tell myself? What is my destructive coping? They will want to change. That's the experience that we've had. So thank you for that question. And we have more resources available that we can share with you as well.
Always remember, from the pulpit is the most powerful place to be vulnerable about your own pain. And it's very influential in helping others. Yeah. That's the best illustration.
And, just in closing, just the coronavirus is pushing pain out in so many ways, in families and job situations and students and occasions that are not happening. People are just experiencing pain in so many ways. Helping them understand what they're doing with their pain is incredibly powerful. So we thank you for this opportunity that we've had with you today. We look forward to seeing you again.